Hello everyone, welcome back to SFTC Mix. In this video, we are going to talk about the trigger framework. So we are going to see what is trigger framework, why we use a trigger framework, and what are the advantages of using the trigger framework, and what happens if we don't use the trigger framework. All this we are going to see in this specific video. So without any delay, let's get started. So let's first understand what is trigger framework. A trigger framework is a structured way to organize and manage trigger logic. It helps in writing scalable, maintainable, bulkified, and testable code. In simple words, we can say trigger framework is a structured way of writing an Apex program by following the certain best practices. So we are going to see what are all those best practices which we use as part of the trigger framework. So before that, let's understand the different patterns of trigger framework because it's not just one single pattern which we use as part of the trigger framework. There are different patterns which are available which business use as per their needs. But in this specific video, we are going to discuss about one single pattern which is simple trigger handler framework because this one would be more than enough to understand the baseline of the trigger framework. There are other patterns which are available as well, like Flip Apex Common Framework, Table Driven Trigger Management, Custom Enterprise Frameworks. These are all the patterns which are available. There are certain details available on this screen on this specific image. If in case you are interested towards it, you can just pause the video and go through these information. And if in case you want to know more, you can just also explore more about these patterns as well. So since we are focusing mainly on the simple trigger handler framework, let's move on with this. So let's understand why do we need a trigger framework. So now we know what is trigger framework. So let's understand why do we need a trigger framework. What happens if we don't use a trigger framework? Like I said, trigger framework is a structured way of writing a program. If anything is not structured or not organized, there would be a certain problem which would occur. Like there can be an issue with the multiple triggers because if you're not following the certain patterns or the certain trigger framework, uh, usually we write multiple triggers for the single object, which would usually cause an issue like issue with handling the order of execution, which would usually cause some conflicts because in trigger usually the order of execution is not guaranteed. So when we write a multiple trigger for the single object, we can't control which particular trigger would fire first, and that can usually cause the conflicts. And there can be a certain issue with the duplicate logic because if we write multiple triggers for the single object, there may be a possibility that similar kind of a logic being used in the multiple triggers, which would cause some inconsistencies. And there can be some issue with the governor limit because Salesforce provides the equal resources for the people who are using the Salesforce. And in order to make sure that the equal amount of the resources is being allocated to the uh, people who are using the Salesforce, Salesforce has certain governor limits. So SOQL 101 error is one of the governor limit that would usually occur if in case you are using the SOQL query within the for loops. And if your for loop is executing more than hundreds of records and you are using the SOQL query within the for loop, that would usually hit the limit and cause the SOQL 101 error. So that can be another problem and difficult to maintain the code. If in case your code is not following the certain structure, it is difficult to manage the code and understand the code as well for the other developers if in case they are looking into that specific code. And there can be a certain problem with the regression because usually in triggers, if the certain structure is not followed or if it doesn't follow certain best practices or something, there can be a possibility that the same kind of a record is getting updated again and again, causing the recursion, which usually refers as a recursion problem. So these are all the problems which can occur if in case we are not using the trigger framework. So now we know these are the problems which would occur if in case we are not using the trigger framework. But what is the solution? How do we solve all these issues? A simple answer, use the trigger framework. If in case we are using the trigger framework, we can definitely avoid all these problems. So If in case you are seeing the solution section here, have one trigger per object. That is one of the straightforward solution. Instead of using the multiple trigger for the single object, have only one trigger so that we have a better control over the order of execution and centralize and reuse the logic. If in case you're using the business logic inside the trigger, move that business logic to the handler class and invoke that class or the method within the trigger and write a bulkified code and efficient code that usually ensures uh, to avoid hitting the governor limit and make the code easy to maintain and test. Always follow the specific best practices and write the code in the structured manner so that it will be easy to understand, maintain, and even if some other developers is looking into your code, they can easily understand the specific code. And avoid the recursion. Preventing the recursion, there are certain methods in order to prevent the recursion which you have to follow in order to prevent the recursion. So we are going to talk about the certain solution among this and related to bulkifying the code and preventing the recursion. I'm going to make a separate videos on that. So I'm not going to explain much about in this video. So I'll be explaining more in the next videos, which I'm going to make among these two. So let's move on and look into other things with a very simple example. So let's move on to the example. So I have a certain Apex class and the triggers already written to keep the video length short. And I have used a very simple example. So I have taken a scenario that whenever I'm creating an account and I'm updating the annual revenue field on the account, the description field should be updated accordingly. I just took two scenario that if in case I'm creating an account or updating an account and the annual revenue is greater than 100, description should update as high value customer. And if the annual revenue is just getting updated from some random number to any other random number, the description should get updated to description updated by trigger. So let's first see if this particular logic is working or not in the Salesforce. And before that, this is a very simple trigger and it is not following any of the trigger framework here. If you see here, all business logics I'm putting inside the trigger directly and I'm not using any context variables or any other best practices. So let's create an account and we'll see if this specific piece of code is working and then we will look into further. So I'll just simply create an account. I'll name it as trigger test 123 and I have a annual revenue field here and there's a description available as well. And right now it is blank if you see. So I will update the annual revenue more than 100, 121 and I will click on save. Okay, so I think there is some error, null pointer exception error. Let's see what is this error. So these are all some error would occur because we are not following the certain best practice or it's not a structured program right now or the structured coding. So let's first see what is this error. Let's resolve the error and we'll move on. Okay, so it's pointing to the null pointer exception. This is because since we are not using any trigger context variable, it is executing both piece of code or both logics. First, it will try to execute this one, and then it will move here, and it will try to execute. And the line number it is showing line number 12, column 1. Okay, so here I'm just trying to get the old value of this account, and then I'm trying to compare the old value of the annual revenue and new value of the annual revenue with the old value of the annual revenue. And right now, we are creating an account, and the old value of the annual revenue was null. There was nothing there, and that is the main reason it is returning the null value because it's not getting the old value here. So what we'll do, we'll just add a logic here to check the null value for the old value as well. If in case the old value is not null, then only execute this particular piece of code, else don't run it. So let's say this. Okay, this one is saved and let me try to save it again. Okay, so the account got saved now. And if I look into this, the description got updated as high value customer. If you see, the annual revenue is greater than 100, and that's why it got updated. And I got some logs generated as well. Let me look into the logs, and I can see, yeah, the logs got updated. Um, the high value customer got updated here on the description. So now, let me see if the update scenario is working as well. I'll just try to change this. And I will click on save. Okay, so the now the description got updated as description updated by trigger, and there should be a logs now as well. Let me open the logs and debug only. And if you see here, so this time both debug lines got updated. So usually I have, both of these logics are getting met, and usually what happens, it is meeting greater than 100 as well. So ideally, it will update this description first, and later this will get executed, and this description will be overwritten uh, with the whatever is the previous description got updated, and that's why you're able to see the two logs got generated. So this is what happens if you directly put everything inside the trigger, because here we don't have control over what to execute when. If in case we are using the trigger context variable, we can define it when exactly to trigger what piece of code or which scenario. So we are going to see that shortly. And before that, we also need to move this business logic to the trigger handler. Why do we need to do that? You may ask the question, because it's very simple logics and just very few lines of the code, and we can easily understand this. Yes. But what if the logics are more? Usually in a real world, the business logics are more and complicated, and a lot of lines of codes would be there. If you put everything inside the trigger itself, it is hard to manage, difficult to understand, and a lot of other things would be there as well. So it's always better to move the business logic to the Apex handler and then call that Apex class or the method from the trigger. And anyway, we are already following one best practice, which is one trigger per object. I have not created any separate trigger for the different, separate trigger for the same object. I only have one specific trigger for this object. So that is done. So now I have named it as a bad trigger because it's not following any trigger best practice now. And I already have a good trigger. Which what I mean is that the piece of code which is following the best practice or the trigger framework. So what I will do, I will just comment out this, and we will execute the trigger which I have created as part of the trigger framework. So I'll just uncomment this. So here what I'm doing, it's the same logic which I'm executing as part of the trigger framework. So here, instead of writing the business logic inside the trigger, I have moved this business logic in this specific handler class. And in the handler class, I'm using the exact same logic which we have seen in the trigger. It's the same scenario, same logic, everything is same. Only the difference is that I have moved the business logics from the trigger to the handler class, and I am calling this class and the method inside the trigger. And along with that, I'm also using the trigger context variable to define when exactly this specific piece of code or the specific methods or the specific logics should run. So if you see here, this particular trigger will run on these trigger events, trigger before insert and before update. That means it will get fired on creation or update. And I want the this particular logic, whatever is there in the before insert, which is update the description as high value customer when the annual revenue is greater than 100, should trigger only on the creation. So that is why I have used this particular context variable, that is trigger dot is insert, so that this particular thing won't run on the update scenario. And I want this to run only in the update scenario, not on the create scenario. So this piece of code would run only on the update scenario, which is if in case the annual revenue is getting updated from some number to some other random number, it should get updated as description updated by trigger. I have also added a OR logic where account revenue is greater than 100. So this will get updated as well. So let's execute this. I think I need to save this. Let me save. Okay. So now let's try to create an account. Test trigger 2, and I will put the annual revenue as more than 100, and description is blank, and I will click on save. So the description got updated as high value customer, and there should be a logs, not this one. Yeah. So the logs got updated because this only based on the trigger context variable. Since it's an insertion, I have created an account. Only this particular block got updated. It won't move here. So let's look into the update scenario. So now what we will do, we'll just update it this. We'll just update this. So I'll just update it to some random number, and I will click on save. So now you can see the description got updated as description updated by trigger. This is because this piece of code got run because I have made it execute in the way that if in case this particular logic is getting met, this trigger context variable is getting met, this particular block will run. And accordingly, this has run now, and this description got updated accordingly. So here what we have done, we have just created a separate handler class, and within the handler class, we have defined the business logic, and we are anyway using the one trigger per one object. And along with that, we are also using some trigger context variable to define when to run what, or when exactly the specific logics should run. So that's how we have a better control over the execution as well. So these are all some part of trigger frameworks. So like I said, I'll be making a separate videos on some parts, which is bulkification and controlling the recursion. So far, this is about the trigger framework. I hope you like the video and to subscribe to my channel so that whenever I post the videos about the recursion um, and other videos, you'll get notified. Thanks for watching the video.